The Murder Scene podcast is a show that may contain graphic descriptions of violent acts, including those of a sexual nature and bad language. If you feel you may be adversely affected by such content, please do not listen. Listener discretion is strongly advised, not intended for children. Hello and welcome to The Murder Scene, a podcast where we delve into the darker side of human nature to explore murders, missing persons, cold cases, serial killers, and all manner of strange, mysterious happenings that fall into the case file marked true crime. I'm your host, Alex. So, hop into the back of my creepy white van filled with grey tarps and duct tape and let's go! The Murder Scene Podcast, Episode Number 6, Part 1, King of the Murder Castle, America's First Serial Killer H. Holmes, the Torture Doctor. This first installment of my series on H. Holmes, I'm largely focusing on the history of Chicago and the Chicago World's Fair. So if you just want to wallow in the wet work, you sick puppy, skip ahead to Part 2. This story is so huge, it's going to be at least 3 or 4 parts, maybe more. I just feel that the history of the city of Chicago is a key part of the H. Holmes story, and even in his killings, as is the fair itself. There was a special convergence happened at this time that made what Holmes did so easy for him to get away with it for so long. I think it's important to delve into the historical context of the era and the city and the fair to help us make sense of Holmes's psychology. But if you didn't give a shite about any of that, skip ahead. The late 19th century was a golden age in the history of the city of Chicago. It was booming, but it had been a long, painful rehabilitation after the Great Fire of 1871. More than 60% of the city was destroyed as the fire spread quickly through the predominantly wooden structures that covered the area, 17,000 of which were razed to the ground, killing 300 people and displacing 100,000, leaving them homeless and some of them ruined and destitute. More than 3 square miles were consumed by the flames that jumped across the south branch of the Chicago River and consumed most of Central. Then it crossed the main artery and erased the near north side. But she and her people were strong and resilient. Unconquerable Chicago would not die in the hellish flames that tried to kill her. She would rise, phoenix-like, from the tragic ashes of death and destruction and become the shining jewel of the Midwestern United States. The post-fire era, the 1880s and 90s, were a most significant era in the development of Chicago as a major city in the United States, and made sure that it kept firmly on the map of modern metropolises and that she had longevity. Industry was booming in Chicago, and that facilitated the need for myriad coal furnaces whose constant stoking filled the air with thick black smoke. Vehicles ran through the city day and night, trains, trolleys, carriages, all with ironclad wheels that made a ubiquitous rumbling noise that would not cease. The city was dirty and dangerous, and offered up so many different ways to die. In the poorer areas, of which there were many. Piles of festering garbage lay around in the streets. Animal corpses were left to lay where they were killed or died, attracting rats and flies. Piles of horse shit and rubbish were washed down the streets and muddy rivers when it rained. Octave Uzan, the French writer and editor, described Chicago best when he called it that Gordian city, so excessive, so satanic. I love that quote. Nailed it. Another darkly apt quote about Chicago at that time came from a German novelist and playwright, Paul Lindau, who called the city a gigantic peep show of horror, but extraordinarily to the point. Again, nailed it. Peep show of horror is a wonderfully apt description for everything that was happening there at that time. And I don't know that that's any different today. It was a place that was both heaven and hell, populated by angels and demons, a place that perfectly embodies the duality of ourselves. All of us are both the light and the darkness, and we all know what a peep show is. A dirty little secret that seduces you in with promises of beauty and sensuality, but really all it is an illusion, and you really don't want to see the truth that lies beneath the mask. Chicago architects Burnham and Root designed an office building christened the Montauk by the man who commissioned them to design and build it, Peter Chardon Brooks III. He coined the term skyscraper. John Welborn Root was given the job of coordinating the World's Fair. Root declared that no one firm should be responsible for the design and construction of something as important as the Columbian Exposition, as the fair was also known, but that architects and builders from all over the United States should be involved in its design and construction. Sadly, Root died before the fair even began, before construction was completed, and his partner, Daniel Burnham, took over the coordinator's job. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 was eventful. Chicago Mayor Carter Hardison Sr. was assassinated by Patrick Eugene Prendergast at the closing ceremony. There was a smallpox epidemic. 32 workers died during the construction of the fairgrounds, and one of the exhibits, the greatest refrigerator on Earth, caught fire, killing 12 firefighters and 3 members of the public, and hundreds of people went missing during its duration. The fair was attended by some very famous people: Nikola Tesla, Thomas Edison, Mark Twain, Buffalo Bill, who was not an official exhibitor but came along anyway and set up his Wild West show on the fringe of the expo, Sitting Bull, Harry Houdini and his brother performing as the brothers Houdini, President Grover Cleveland, Susan B. Anthony, and African-American leaders who exhibited their achievements and showcased the societal change that had occurred since the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Joseph Douglas was there, a noted concert violinist and the grandson of famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Pianist Scott Joplin attended, as did Bohemian composer Antonin Dvorak. There were artists and sculptors like Adam Emery Albright, Maitland Armstrong, Gary Melchers, John Singer Sargent, Cyrus Dallin, Carl Brooks McNeil, Charles Grafley. Some of the inventions debuted at the World's Fair were the chicken egg incubator, the seismograph, the dishwasher, the refrigerator, and a braille printing system to make books for the blind. The fair was a celebration of the 400-year anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World in 1492. It was also held to show the whole world that Chicago was reborn and stronger than ever after the fire. And there was also a man who was not a native Chicagoan, but had moved there, probably specifically for the dark and sinister opportunities a fair like the Expo promised. America's first serial killer. A man who is also a very plausible candidate for the OG serial killer, Jack the Ripper himself. Of course, we're talking about the notorious, the infamous, Devil in the White City, King of the Murder Castle, the torture doctor himself, H. Holmes. Holmes was born Herman Webster Mudgett on May 16, 1861, in the small New Hampshire town of Gilmanton. The quaint, sleepy little place was settled by the families of both his parents, the Mudgetts and the Prices, 100 years before he was born. Mudgett's parents were Methodists. His mother, Theodate Page Price, was a devoutly religious woman, and his father, Levi Horton Mudgett, was a very strict disciplinarian and a chronic alcoholic who abused his family. Herman was extremely intelligent, and that made him a target for ignorant, envious classmates who he claimed bullied him mercilessly. One childhood memory that left a lasting impression on Herman was when one day 2 of his classmates from school forced him into the local doctor's office. They knew he was deathly afraid of the full-size skeleton, which would have been a real human one at that time. They forced him toward it and wrapped its ivory spindle arms around him, its sharp finger bones scratching at his face. Little Herman was screaming, terrified of the toothy grin leering at him, its bones playing a hollow melody as it pawed at him. But then something happened inside Herman during this strange incident. Something changed. This moment would stay with him his entire life, and he would recount it in his memoir decades later. The incident cured him of his childish fears regarding the skeleton. It actually made him want to be a doctor and gave him his lifelong obsession with death and the human anatomy. All 3 of those things would become the hallmarks of his murderous career. It's particularly interesting that he would later make part of his living, stripping the skin and meat from his murder victims to sell their skeletons to sawbones and universities across the country. Of course, there's always a distinct possibility that Holmes's story about the whole skeleton incident is complete shite. And perhaps it was a hook to evoke sympathy from the public, maybe a ploy to try and escape the death penalty, because poor Ickle-Wickle Hermy didn't want to be a human monster at all. The signs that Herman wasn't quite right, not like the other children in town, started at a young age. While still a child, Herman became the apprentice of Dr. Nahum White, a local doctor with a practice in Gilmanton. The doctor would perform post-mortem examinations and conduct dissections, all assisted by young Herman Mudgett. Regardless of his superior intellect and academic achievements, he was still so young to be exposed to such things without consequence. By the time he entered his teens, he was torturing and killing small animals, dissecting them to study their inner workings of their anatomy, and let's face it, probably for shits and giggles too. And in a town of just 1,600 or so people, and when the murder rate for the United States was around 1 in 100,000 deaths, there was a string of unusual or unexplained deaths of children whilst Herman was there, including 2 of his own cousins. Olin Edward Mudgett, a cousin of Herman's, a wee boy of only 4 years old, drowned. Herman would have been around 15 years old when this incident occurred. Mary Mudgett was Herman's teenage cousin. Around 1879, she was found dead in her nightclothes in a creek. Herman had been one of the last people who was known to be in her company. He would have been around 18 years old at this time. Other children, around the same span of a few years, died under abnormal circumstances, a poisoning, drownings, other very young people for whom no cause of death was listed. And there may have been more. There are always gaps in missing information from county or parish records from those days, and so there may have been other deaths that were simply not recorded. When Mudgett took off from medical school, he effortlessly slipped into the role of cunning, conniving conman and invented his infamous insurance scams whilst attending the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery, a school where his academic performance was lackluster. Herman would dig up corpses, or use the ones from classes at med school, and assign a fake identity to them, take out an insurance policy against them, then burn the assigned cadaver in a fire so that it was rendered unrecognizable. He'd then collect the insurance money on the crispy corpse. He did this many times. He also had a side hustle going with one of his professors. It was alleged that they began grave robbing to produce cadavers for dissection and anatomy classes at the university. When he eventually had to flee to avoid charges relating to his fraudulent insurance scams, he decided to change his name. Herman Webster Mudgett was dead, but a monster was born to take his place. Henry Howard Holmes, or H. Holmes, a name that would live on well beyond his earthly tenure and become almost mythical, as if he was a monster that did not really exist and was just conjured by an overactive creative mind, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where you're never really sure who the real villain is, the doctor or his Promethean creation. But Holmes was not the product of a tortured writer in an opium fugue. He was real, a real monster, a self-made monster, or maybe he was the devil like he claimed to be. Holmes schemed and scammed his way across the country for a few years, scamming people out of land and carrying on with his insurance scams. Then he heard of an exciting new hunting ground that sounded ripe for the picking. It would turn out to be the most perfect place for a man like him. It was a land of opportunity, a dream come true for a predator always on the prowl for vulnerable, naive women to exploit and abuse. He heard about the Chicago World's Fair that was due to begin in 1893. He knew there would be millions of people who would attend the fair over the course of its 6-month run to see the latest in everything from manufacturing technology to new food products and exotic people and their cultures that Americans had never experienced before from all around the globe. People would flock there, and there would be single females traveling alone, either to see the fair or to gain employment there, or any of the businesses and services that stretched for miles around the fairgrounds and across the White City. These wide-eyed young women, some of them barely out of childhood, and had never even seen anything but the inside of their podunk county boundaries. They were like abundant ripened fruits, waiting to be plucked straight from a laden vine. They were victims waiting for a predator to devour them. Some of them were little more than girls who believed themselves to be modern, worldly young women, sophisticated and independent and capable, and perhaps some of them may have been, under ordinary circumstances, but they were no match for a man like Holmes. He'd been contemplating their demise since they were still schoolgirls. Holmes was about as premeditated a murderer as you can get. He literally planned these murders years in advance, and so meticulously, in excruciating detail, that he designed an entire building in which to carry out his heinous crimes and schemes that became known as the Murder Castle. There were, conservatively, hundreds of women and girls who went missing during the Chicago World's Fair. The fact is, there was never an official figure released on how many people went missing. The Chicago police at one point admitted that it could have been hundreds, but it was impossible to even give a guesstimate. There could have been hundreds of the disappeared women and girls who went through the murder castle alone, never mind anywhere else. But the true number will never be known. Some of them just left home and were never seen nor heard from again. They left behind their small-town folks who waved goodbye to their little girls at train stations, some of them maybe knowing that was the last time they would ever see her smile, her beautiful face, but they let her go because it was the modern age, and maybe, just maybe, if you let her spread her wings and fly, perhaps she may come home someday. Even before the World's Fair began, it was not difficult to die in Chicago. There were outbreaks of diseases like cholera, diphtheria, typhus, and the flu. And you can bet that H. Holmes was not the only serial killer working either. He wouldn't have been the only psychopath who had the idea that there would be easy prey at the Chicago World's Fair. That's it for part 1. I'll see you in part 2. Cheerio. Thanks for listening. Go to themurderscene.com or at the Murder Scene Podcast on YouTube for all our social media links. For a full list of research sources and credits, please see the show notes below if you're listening to a podcast, or see the end credits if you're watching a video. See you next week.